So, Steven, for the uninitiated, why are you currently on trial?
Well, I am a human rights lawyer who spent many years working with indigenous peoples in the Ecuadorian Amazon to win a very large pollution judgment against Chevron. And this judgment has been affirmed by 6 appellate courts, 29 appellate judges, Supreme Courts of Canada, and Ecuador. And the reason I'm on trial is because Chevron, in retaliation for winning this judgment, sued me, claiming I'm a racketeer and that the entire case that I've been working on for the bulk of my professional career is somehow a fraud. So I reject those allegations, but Chevron, without a jury, convinced a judge to credit one of their witnesses to whom they paid $2 million, who claimed he was in a meeting where I offered a bribe. It's not true. It's been rejected by, again, 29 appellate judges. But it resulted in me being charged with criminal contempt of court in a case orchestrated by Chevron that is essentially being prosecuted by a Chevron law firm, not by the U.S. government. So I'm in a very unusual, I would say unprecedented situation. And I think it's problematic for me. I'm trying to get through it. But I think more than that, it's terrifying for what it means for the rule of law in our country. It's basically a new corporate playbook to attack human rights lawyers and activists, to silence their advocacy so the fossil fuel industry can, protect its profits as it destroys the planet. So I know that's a lot to absorb. I get it. It's kind of a big thing. But bottom line is I'm on trial for those larger reasons, in my opinion.
So what was the underlying judgment against Chevron?
It was a pollution judgment based on overwhelming scientific and testimonial evidence that the company in Ecuador deliberately dumped 16 billion gallons of cancer-causing toxic waste into the rainforest onto indigenous ancestral lands, really leading to a mass industrial poisoning of a 1,500 square mile area that was home to 5 indigenous groups. So, as my friend Paul Passimino of Amazon Watch says, this was is a slow mass murder. I mean, basically, when you deliberately poison a huge swath of rainforest where people are living and dependent on natural water sources for their survival, you are making a decision to kill a lot of people. Even if you don't deliberately go out and kill them, that will be a foreseeable result. That's criminal. And that's what Texaco did originally in the 1960s, and later Chevron bought Texaco, and they now own the problem, and they're defending it, unfortunately.
And the judgment was $9.5 billion, but has not been paid, even though that was back in 2012. What's been going on there?
Well, this is classic corporate misdirection, right? I mean, indigenous peoples go to court, they play by the rules, they win a large environmental judgment, really the largest ever. It's historic. Chevron threatens them with a lifetime of litigation. Chevron's lawyers, unless they drop their claims, they refuse, they carry on. They need to clean up their forest to save their lives. And Chevron has hired 60 law firms and 2,000 lawyers to fight the indigenous peoples of Ecuador and to evade paying this judgment. They have literally spent $2-3 billion in legal and professional fees, money that could have gone down into Ecuador to clean up this toxic mess. So again, people's lives could have been saved. Instead of doing that, they're paying these high-priced lawyers. I mean, just in my trial this week, there were 2 Chevron lawyers who testified they bill Chevron $1,300 per hour, millions of dollars per year, to fight the indigenous peoples of Ecuador and to target their legal team, including myself. So Chevron has made I think a horrendously immoral, unethical, and frankly illegal decision to pay lawyers to attack the very people they poisoned, rather than comply with the rule of law and various court judgments that they clean up the pollution that they cause that's killing off these indigenous groups. It's unbelievable. And, one of the reasons they have targeted me is they're trying to silence those who speak out about it. I mean, they don't want me on your show. They have tried desperately. And I've been on a fair number of podcasts over the years and more recently and done interviews. They have what I call a legal goon squad. Whenever they hear like a major media organ, like say the New York Times is even thinking about doing an interview with me, they deployed this this group of people to threaten them with lawsuits, or they'll advertise, or they'll withdraw advertising money. They use every kind of leverage they can possibly find to prevent the story from getting out there in the big media. I mean, there's a reason why this has been covered in The Guardian, The Nation, The Intercept, and there hasn't been a word about it in the New York Times or on CNN or on MSNBC or any of the big networks. It's really an outrage that it has not been covered more.
Can you characterize, describe for the audience the nature of the RICO charges that they brought against you?
So Chevron's theory was that our entire case that I've been working on at that time for 18 years was a sham. There's massive pollution all over Ecuador. The courts of Ecuador, where Chevron wanted the trial held, had 105 technical expert reports that documented, probably the world's worst oil pollution. And again, this was not an accident. This was by design, done deliberately to save money. So having, faced with the fact it lost the case in court, Chevron needed to kind of find a way to turn the tables so as not to pay the judgment. And they charged you with racketeering. Now, the RICO statute in America was passed to target the mafia. It's passed by Congress decades ago. And Chevron has now created a playbook to turn it around and target human rights lawyers and activists, claiming that our work campaigning for justice, campaigning for accountability for polluters, is equivalent to mob activity. And, this, again, is one of the bigger issues involved in my case. What they're trying to do to me is intimidate those who take on this critical frontline work necessary to hold polluters accountable and save the planet. And, in a time of structural decline, when the oil industry is declining, people are transitioning to clean energy. They're hurting. They're worried about the future, and they're trying to go after anyone who holds them accountable. And that, I believe, is what's happening to me. And they concocted this whole racketeering theory to explain the behavior, not just to me, but of scientific consultants, journalists, campaigners at Amazon Watch, other lawyers. It's kind of crazy, but they got this judge who's a former tobacco industry lawyer to accept their theory without a jury. One of the things they do is they don't go into trials in the United States that they can't control the outcome of. So when they don't want juries, and this is my second trial without a jury, I will lose both trials because the whole thing is kind of cooked up behind the scenes. And it's just impossible, apparently, to stop other than through public support, which I need desperately.
So the reason there's no jury is because they specifically have brought charges that don't trigger your right to a jury. Is that right?
I don't agree. I mean, I think I am legally entitled to a jury, and that will be a major issue on appeal after this one judge who's a member of the Federalist Society, which Chevron funds, convicts me. She will convict me. There's no doubt in my mind, even though I'm innocent, even though the charges are baseless, even though the charges which were generated by her colleague, Judge Kaplan, were rejected by the U.S. Attorney's Office. There is no legitimate basis for this prosecution against me right now. The basis is to silence me, and it's being run by Chevron, and we have learned that Chevron is spending millions of dollars to help a private law firm that Chevron used, a second law firm. They're paying one law firm millions of dollars to help a second law firm appointed by Judge Kaplan to prosecute me. This is a Chevron prosecution. It is the world's, or our country's, first corporate criminal prosecution, and it's just unconstitutional. This whole thing against me now, I believe, is going to be thrown out because it just never had any legality to begin with. Beyond that, the charges, I think, are utterly baseless. No one in America has ever been prosecuted. No lawyer has, for doing what I did, which is to fight for my client's rights in kind of a civil discovery context. And by the way, after he charged me, they locked me up in my home. This is the 651st day that I have an ankle bracelet on. And I'm sitting in my 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan on a misdemeanor where the maximum sentence ever imposed for someone convicted, I have not been convicted, the maximum sentence ever imposed on someone convicted is 90 days of home confinement. I've been over 8 times that amount. I mean, what's up, guys?
So when's the last time you left your house? When's the last time you
I do get to go out with 48 hours permission for very narrow purposes like legal meetings, court appearances, school events related to my 14-year-old son. So I do get out, for little bits of time here and there. but I can never just leave when I want. I need 48 hours permission. I can't even go. I live in a building in Manhattan. I can't even go to the lobby to get the mail. And I'm stuck, and that's exactly how Chevron wants it, right? Because they don't want me floating around the world, visiting my clients in Ecuador, going to Canada to work with lawyers to help enforce the judgment. They want me locked up so their risk goes down, and they are abusing the law, abusing their power, I think violating the law to do so. And I think all of this is ultimately going to be overturned. At least I hope it is.
How is it that a private entity in a civil case is essentially prosecuting you as if you were accused of a crime in a criminal case?
It's just unbelievable. I don't know. I mean, I look, I'm not unsophisticated. Okay. I went to Harvard Law School and I've been working around the legal profession for many years. I never knew until this case, that a private law firm could prosecute someone criminally and deprive them of their liberty, much less a law firm with ties to Chevron, the very entity that I beat in court to win this historic pollution judgment. How is it that Chevron is able to get control of a governmental prosecution? And, there's another kind of bizarre feature, which is it's being funded also by taxpayers. Like Chevron's paying law firm A, Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, to help law firm B, the prosecutors at Seward and Kissel, prosecute me. Seward and Kissel separately is being paid by taxpayers. There's a court fund. They've been paid almost $1 million to prosecute me on a misdemeanor. They're for-profit prosecutors. They don't care how long the case lasts. They don't care how long I'm in detention. I repeat, the government refused to prosecute me. I am being prosecuted by Chevron directly. It is so wrong. And by the way, we've asked Merrick Garland in the Biden administration to deal with this. I mean, I think this is a major litmus test for Biden on climate, right? How can you support, dealing effectively with climate, the climate issue, the Green New Deal, while a human rights lawyer is detained on a misdemeanor at home for almost 2 years for doing the frontline work? Okay, that is wrong. And we're asking Merrick Garland and the Biden administration's Department of Justice to step in and take the case over from the Chevron private law firm that's prosecuting me.
Logistically, posture-wise, I'm just having. How should we understand this? So the U.S. Attorney's Office declined to prosecute for whatever reason. They didn't see there was enough there. And then how did it come to be that a private law firm, that Gibson Dunn, was put in a position to run this prosecution? So,
okay, it's simple. In very rare circumstances, there's a rule that allows judges to appoint a private prosecutor when their contempt charges, contempt of court charges, which means a lawyer supposedly disobeys a court order, are rejected by the regular federal prosecutor. And that has happened on very rare occasions, extremely rare. I'd say 10 times in the last 50 years in this country.
Why does that exemption exist for?
I don't know. Congress has given judges this power to enforce their own rules. I think it's subject to abuse, but there was a logic to giving them this power. But listen, this is not that. This is something different than that. This is using that very rare, extraordinary power to appoint a private prosecutor, to appoint a Chevron prosecutor. In other words, if you're going to appoint a private prosecutor, the prosecutor has to be disinterested, have no conflict of interest. And here we have a flagrant conflict of interest where the person prosecuting me, Rita Glavin, is a partner in a law firm that has Chevron and many big oil and gas companies as clients.
Well, what has the court said? Because I'm sure that you objected to that.
I did object to that, but I'm objecting to the very judge who did it.
But what rationale does she give in response to your motion? I mean,
there's no rationale. It's she just denies. There's no rationale. I have an extremely biased judge. Briahna, I beg of you to understand, this is like, Putin's courts in New York.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to get a sense of how flagrant.
It's flagrant.
It is. Is there some pro forma rationale given, or is she just like no motion denied, like not a sentence
There's
more?
Some pro forma stuff here and there, but she, look, the whole thing is a closed circle, right? So you have the judge who charged me. He appointed Preska, who's the presiding judge. They're close friends, Federalist Society, ties to Chevron. They appoint the Chevron law firm, and they just all work together. They talk behind the scenes, which is totally unethical. For example, we asked for all their communications, and, Judge Preska denied it. She's not a neutral judge. She's protecting them. So it's ultimately all this is going to come out on appeal. And I think we have a very strong appeal because, frankly, I think this whole court process is corrupt.
The only reason I'm asking is I also formerly was an attorney, and I remember switching from one law firm to another.
Law books in the back of you there.
That's what's happening. Couldn't get rid of some of them.
I know.
But I whether or not, moving from one firm to another or working on some, pro bono matters, I was in my very short career conflicted out of doing things.
Yeah.
Right. Conflicted out of doing a couple pro bono cases that I really wanted to work on. And the idea that you would file a motion to say there's an obvious conflict of interest because this law firm profits handily off of doing work with this company, and that what could they possibly argue? Oh, there's a Chinese wall that magically the court is going to pretend creates no conflict of interest. It feels really incredible to me.
It's incredible. I've never seen it. It's embarrassing for our country. It's extraordinary. I mean, look, let me try to explain it in the most simple terms possible. Okay. I helped my indigenous clients win an historic pollution judgment against Chevron in Ecuador in 2013. Right now, I'm being prosecuted in U.S. courts by a Chevron law firm that has deprived me of my liberty. This is the first private corporate prosecution in American history. And we have to pay attention to this. We cannot let our society drift into this autocratic, authoritarian, weird place where our courts are used as an instrumentality, really, to politically attack a person who has taken on and held accountable a major polluter by the polluter. I mean, that's what's happened here. This is what happens. Sarah Lee Whitson, a good friend of mine, worked for Human Rights Watch for years in the Middle East. She's like, I saw this all the time in the Middle East, where courts are used by the powers that be to cook up cases, to put a veneer of due process over what are really political decisions already made to try to destroy someone who is a dissident or is a critic of the regime. And that's what's happening to me. I mean, not officially by the U.S. government. It's happening via Chevron's ability to wrest control of the judiciary. And by the way, all this stuff about our courts, what happened under the Trump administration, the multi-decade effort to control the federal judiciary by the Federalist Society, by the Koch brothers, all of that is at play in what's happening to me. That is, the judges involved are all out of that network. And it's not right. I contest it. I complain about it. We will fight it. We will continue fighting. And ultimately, I believe we will prevail. But part of our strategy is to talk about it, because until people really understand how dangerous this is and that it is happening here in New York to me, I don't think people are going to step up and say something. And by the way, I mean, your disbelief in me telling the story is normal. Like most people are like, no, that can't be happening. What? And you have to explain it like 3 times. It's so out of sorts to even consider.
What are the next steps in your case?
Well, my so-called trial, which I say in quotes because there was no jury and there was no fairness, ended yesterday. We were actually thrilled with how it went. I mean, the judge looked like what we said, completely biased. We made our points. We created a great appellate record, and we called attention to the unfairness. The next step is the parties have to submit written closing arguments in 2 weeks. Ours will be powerful. There's no basis for this prosecution, much less a conviction, but she'll probably do it anyway, and at which point she'll set a sentencing date and maybe try to put me in jail. I need help.
I thought the maximum charge was house arrest for 90 days or what have you.
That was the maximum sentence on any previous case, but this is different because they're trying to destroy me. That was a normal case. This is a political case. So the maximum sentence is actually 6 months in prison by law because it's a misdemeanor. But I mean, there's never been a lawyer sentenced to prison for this, especially one with no criminal record like me. And again, I think the charges are baseless. And if they were real, first I should be given a jury. So unbiased fact finders can look at this and make a decision rather than a judge who has financial ties to Chevron, as well as to the judge who prosecuted me. So the whole thing smells, it stinks, it's rotten. And ultimately she will sentence me to something. I mean, I'm hoping to nothing, but she seems to be out to get me. So I'm expecting potentially a jail sentence. And I need help. A bunch of congresspersons, including Jamie Raskin and Jim McGovern and Cori Bush and AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Jamal Bowman signed a letter to the DOJ asking them to intervene and take over the case. And we need more support out of Congress. We need more support from people of influence to call attention to this travesty of justice.
What can our listeners do to support you?
Well, thank you for asking. We have a website. It's called freedonziger.org, freedonziger.org, where you can go and there's a lot of information about the case and you can sign up for our campaign. We have gotten thousands of people who have signed up. We send a newsletter around. And you can also donate to my legal defense fund to fight these monsters takes resources, as you can imagine. We've gotten thousands of small donors. We have a very small donor strategy. Give $5, whatever, get involved. If you can't give money, don't worry, go to the site anyway and sign up. And we're building a movement. I mean, the movement is not just to protect me. It's more importantly to protect the people that they're really targeting, which are the indigenous peoples, the farmer communities in the Amazon. They think by detaining me, silencing me, locking me up, they can somehow evade paying the court judgment that the people of Ecuador won against them, against Chevron. So it's very important to remember this is bigger than me, but we need to protect me and people like me who do this kind of frontline work. Or, really, if that doesn't happen, the victims of this poisoning and of these human rights violations will not get a remedy. And ultimately, the fossil fuel industry will continue its planet-destroying pollution practices, and we can't let that happen.
Did I read rightly that you attended Harvard Law and used to play basketball with Barack Obama?
Yes.
I don't suppose there's any direct appeal that you've made there or heard anything from him in the sphere of influence.
Yeah. I'd love it if Barack would join the campaign. Maybe he has. I don't know. I mean, it's very hard as former president to sort of interfere with an active legal casing. I recognize that. But, we're doing all we can to get everyone out there to jump in, from Bill Clinton to others. But it's complicated, right? This is a former president with whom at one time I had a personal relationship, although I haven't talked to him for many years. I hope he would do something. So if he's out here listening, please go to freedonziger.org, learn more, make sure you're up to speed. And if you can't do something, please do. But, more importantly, I think the movement, we have 68 Nobel laureates who signed on, 6 congresspersons. We have 200 lawyers who signed a judicial complaint about Judge Kaplan's misconduct that they put into the New York Court of Appeals. 37 bar associations around the world have complained about this. Human rights groups from Amnesty International to Global Witness wrote a letter to Garland. We have law students from 53 different U.S. law schools who wrote a letter to Garland asking him to do something. We have gotten a lot of support. We need more support. There needs to be more pressure, more visibility. And again, I would call on Joe Biden and the Biden administration to really take a good hard look at this. You cannot be for the Green New Deal. You cannot adequately address the climate challenge of today, which threatens our planet, while letting lawyers be locked up in your own country via a corporate criminal prosecution, which is obviously unconstitutional.
And
this
judgments
needs to be stopped.
And not actually paid. I mean, we just had an environmental
and the judgment's not actually paid.
These companies are never forced to internalize their externalities, and therefore you get off.
That is exactly what happened. They they privatize the profits, socialize the costs onto the backs of the most vulnerable communities on the planet. It's so wrong. Look, they went to court and held them accountable for doing that, and they still won't pay the judgment. So ultimately, this is about people in Ecuador, indigenous groups and others trying to survive, not die. They're being exposed daily to toxins in the water they drink and the food they eat, the air they breathe. We need to think about them, and we need to stop these monsters from locking up their lawyers, because without their lawyers, they really are defenseless. So it's all connected. We need to really deal with this problem writ large, and we need more and more people involved, and we need people to call on the DOJ and Biden to do something about this and stop this travesty of justice from continuing.
Barack Obama, you can go to freedonziger.org. You can sign up for the newsletter. You can send the $5, and so can everyone else in the link in the description of this episode. Steven Donziger, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
All right, let's meet our guest today. She is an Academy Award-winning actress. Her work can be seen in Atlantic City, Thelma and Louise, Lorenzo's Oil, Dead Man Walking, The Hunger, The Witches of Eastwick, Bull Durham, and others. I'm not going through the whole list. Susan Sarandon.
Hi.
And she is a best-selling author, spiritual leader, activist, 2020 presidential candidate, and now podcaster, making her return appearance to Bad Faith, Marianne Williamson.
Sure.
I could sit here and talk to you each and both about any number of things that hopefully we'll have time to cycle back to at the end of the interview. But primarily you are here to give us a first-person account of a really important trial that's going on right now, and which has been foreclosed from the public sightline because even though everything is happening on Zoom right now, the judge has determined that there will be no Zoom broadcast. So we need a first-person account of what's been going on with the Steven Donziger trial. Can you give us a little background of why you chose to go and what you witnessed?
When I first heard about it, the thing that was so shocking, before I even knew that I would be attending the trial, was this idea that a company like Chevron can choose to dump, not have a spill, not have an accident, but actually decide to dump toxic waste, oil, carcinogenic substances into the water of indigenous people where they bathe, where they drink, where they live, and assume because they are who they are and don't have a voice that they can get away with it. That to me was so shocking. And then once they were busted, and this lawyer, who was an environmental lawyer, spent a lot of time getting the case together and sued for reparations and won millions of dollars, and every court recognized it. Still, it wasn't done. They then went out of their way to basically make this guy's life miserable and make him an example. And also, the other aspect of it that's so horrible is that Chevron basically has bought the judge and the prosecutor when they didn't want to try the case in New York. They didn't, and they went ahead and hired a private prosecutor. And the judge is part of the Federal Society, which is funded by Chevron, and the law office that the prosecutor comes from also is connected to Chevron. So it's really a test of just how corrupt you can get with a very powerful corporation taking over what we think of as our right to a free trial, or to, and also it's been very difficult for him to get any press. Nobody wants to cover this. Marianne, what else would you add to that?
Well, this is a story that has to do with big oil and its feeling of entitlement that it can do whatever it wants to do anywhere in the world, and nobody can challenge them. And there is so much arising consciousness in the world today about the environment, about the nefarious behavior of big oil, and also about Latin America. As Susan said, they knew what they were doing. In order to save $3 for a pit, you already had standards that are far too minimum regarding environmental protection, even according to the United States law. It was even lower according to Ecuadorian law. And they wouldn't even do that. In order to save $3 a pit, they wouldn't line them at all. In fact, they even told the people, this was Texaco at the time, it was back in the 1960s, they actually told these people that the oil, it was good. It was like milk. It had vitamins in it. So when the Ecuadorian court, for the sake of 30,000 Ecuadorian farmers whose lives were so affected by this, this was a huge deal that the Ecuadorian court would give what amounted ultimately to a $9 billion settlement. That was down from the original 18. Now, Chevron had argued that the case be removed from the United States because they knew that in an American court they might have a problem. They had argued that the case be removed to Ecuador, and on the agreement that move it to Ecuador, I guess they thought they could buy that one off easier, I assume, because their argument was let it move to Ecuador, and then whatever the Ecuadorian court demands, then we will give. They were apparently shocked when the Ecuadorian court came down with the settlement. And we actually have emails that show that their main strategy to fight this off was to come after the lawyer. They know, Big Oil knows, if you're going to have these human rights lawyers and these environmental lawyers that can win cases like this could break open, people could think, who knows what the slaves might do, right? Who knows what people might think they can do anywhere in the world. So there's something going on here, everything that Susan said, and that this is a message not just to Susan. This is a message to the entire environmental movement. It's a message to any environmental lawyer or human rights activist or lawyer who has any idea that they can come after the Chevrons of the world. We got to stop that right here. And that, I know, is why I've shown up. And from what I've heard Susan say, I think that we're all agreed on that.
What it feels like with this case is it's one of these instances where corporations are so used to behaving with impunity, and the idea that if you go to a different part of the world where the local population doesn't have as much power or much rights or as many rights, or where there's a bigger imbalance, even greater than we have here between corporations and people, that they can act with impunity. And what's really interesting about this case is, Steven Donziger is this guy who's a Harvard-educated lawyer who I'm sure he used to play basketball with Barack Obama, who in many ways might have had access to halls of privilege in a very different career trajectory, who I read initially went to Ecuador because he had a law school friend who just conveyed to him what was happening where he was from, and then had this very organic humanistic interest in what was going on there. And then brought this case, as you mentioned, Marianne, in the Southern District of New York, thinking, okay, a New York jury, a New York venue is going to be more friendly to a case where people might be able to act with impunity because it's, again, happening in a deep, dark, other part of the world. And I think there was a lot of concern when the case was moved, when Chevron did win the change of venue back to Ecuador, that was going to be the end of the whole thing. And so then when Steven manages to secure this $9.5 billion judgment, despite that real strategic setback, I think it seems like it just really blew them mind.
Oh, yeah. Pissed them off.
Right. And now it feels like a very personalized attack as a consequence of the fact that this isn't supposed to happen. In their minds. This isn't supposed to be the way it goes. Individuals are not, and usually they don't. It's an extremely skewed arena. As we've talked about a little on the show, our legal system is so incredibly skewed against class actions and then the ability to show causation with these kinds of environmental harms. We just did an environmental episode with Kate Aronoff, an environmental reporter, where we talked about some of these things. And here's a case where the little guy won. So from your experience in the courtroom, what are the actions of the judge that have given you the impression that the legal system itself, that the judge herself is biased against Steven in this case?
Oh my God, it was just completely obvious, so patronizing. Anything that tried to be brought forward, because it's a non-jury trial, right? They lost the jury, which means that then certain things hold, and with the jury something else holds. So she just kept saying everything was of no interest. He wasn't allowed to give a statement. When his lawyers would come up, she would constantly interrupt, and say, are you sure you want to go into that now in your opening statement? I mean, you only have so much time. And he would talk again. Well, are you really want to say that? And just anything to interrupt the flow. And it was just quite clear that, it was a done deal already. I mean, it was basically, what would you say, Marianne? It was pretty shocking, really.
Well, she didn't even make a show of impartiality. And remember, this is a Chevron trial. This Steven is not being tried in front of an American courtroom. The New York passed. New York passed. And so because of this weird loophole, the judge was able to give it to Chevron to prosecute. Who knew this could even happen in America? He's not being prosecuted by the United States, even though it says that. He's being prosecuted by Chevron. This is literally a show trial. And that's why what everybody is asking is for people to please contact Merrick Garland's office and ask that this case be removed from Chevron's hands. It's literally a corporation prosecuting an American individual. And also, it's not just one man. It's 30,000 farmers, 30,000 indigenous peoples in Ecuador for far less money than they have spent already trying to prosecute Steven Donziger. They could have cleaned up that area of the Amazon where they did all that damage for far less money than they have already spent trying to destroy his life. And remember, he's been under house arrest for over 600 days.
Which is unprecedented.
Unprecedented.
Yeah.
They still have not paid any of the money to those people. This money is to help with their medical bills. These are people who are getting cancer, deformities, horrible things happening because of that. Like Susan talked about the carcinogens. And they have said that they will stay on this case till hell freezes over. This is a red line. And once again, it's not a red line for them just about Steven Donziger. It's about all of us who think that we have a right to call big oil on its crimes.
Right. So Steven is being tried for contempt of court. And the contempt charge is based on his failure to disclose certain documents, which he says he shouldn't disclose because of attorney-client privilege, which is one of the more sacred justifications in a legal context for not actually disclosing documents.
They wanted his cell phone and his computer. That's what they asked for.
Right. So what this does feel like in the broader context, to your point, Marianne, this, $9.5 billion judgment came down in 2012, I believe. And there have been numerous efforts in numerous courts across the world, brought in an effort to actually make Chevron pay. The most, I think, last and most significant of which was in Canada. And the Canadian courts just made it very clear that they considered Chevron Canada to be a separate entity than the Chevron that was operating in Ecuador. And so these are the kinds of procedural barriers that get thrown up that make it so that even judgments aren't dispositive. Even if you win, you still manage to lose. And so now, as you mentioned, I just want to clarify for the audience, there are very narrow circumstances in which a prosecution can be brought not by the state. If this isn't the Attorney General's office bringing these charges, they declined to prosecute. The professionals made a judgment that there wasn't enough here. The juice wasn't worth the squeeze. I'm sorry, go ahead, Marianne.
Well, when Susan and I were in the courtroom, we heard the judge say, well, they only didn't do that because of lack of resources.
Well, but Gibson Dunn, this private law firm that has some unsavory, some suspicious connections to the industry, to these oil companies, certainly does have the resources and the incentive to prosecute, right? Yeah. So the conflict of interest there is pretty remarkable.
I'd also like to point out that in this case, this is not just client-attorney privilege. Let's remember who these clients are. Let's all wake up now about Latin America, okay? We're talking about a bunch of environmental activists in Ecuador. If you were their lawyer, would you want to give their names and numbers and addresses to Chevron? Yeah.
I mean, this is an area of kind of environmental coverage that actually doesn't get covered that often. The extent to which real violence and the kind of criminal activity that we associate with other kinds of enterprises, drug enterprises, et cetera, is going on in the environmental context, which should be no surprise given how much money is at stake. And again, how much impunity people can act with in other parts of the world, especially when we're talking about drilling in areas like the Amazon with where the people are especially economically disenfranchised as compared to the status quo. It's really villainous stuff. And one aspect of what's so remarkable about this case is how little mainstream coverage there has been of it.
Well, I guess you have to ask yourself why, right? Mm-hmm. Because they certainly reached out to everyone. And that's kind of in a way, Marianne and I were calling during the break, trying to find if David Sirota knew people at the Times that he could call. I mean, who maybe there is one person at the Times who would come around, but every time we mentioned it in terms of getting eyes on this for so many different reasons, not only just to put pressure to get another trial, but also just to let people know what's at stake, they just have had very little luck. And so we were trying to pull in some of our connections, and we knew that, people who cover something in more than just 2 sentences, more than just clickbait, trying to find someone who can say the significance of this, not just for Steven, but as we've been saying, what this means going forward in terms of what activists and journalists and everybody are risking if Chevron can just take over the whole judicial system. I mean, she was reading a newspaper at one point during the trial, the judge, that was caught reading the newspaper. I mean, she was barely, it was so condescending and so nasty most of the time and provocative that I think it was truly shocking. I mean, wasn't it? It was very disheartening. The last day, especially because I went to the last day, which was yesterday, and he was hoping to read a statement, and she said it didn't have any bearing. His motivations for things weren't significant to the case. So I don't know who you ask that is, it's significant if it's not him. Because they were trying to make it seem as if he was just willfully being a wise ass and not turning over his things. And they had tried so many different ways of, anyway, it's just very clear when you're sitting there that it was a farce.
Susan's phrase, Chevron took over the U.S. judicial system. That's it in a nutshell. This is about the corporate takeover of the U.S. government to such an extent, and without even pretense at this point. This was Chevron prosecuting an American citizen in a U.S. courtroom.
And it's also so racist. Most of these environmental spills and disregard for people happen to poor people of color. That's why the pipeline Standing Rock went where it went, because the town didn't want it. So it goes through, the Native American territory. It's just, that's the way it works. It's always people that they assume don't count and assume won't be heard or organized, that don't have the means to fight back in their territory. So that's again why this is so shocking and so important.